How was the plane illegal? It wasn't. The Hawker Typhoon was a standard Royal Air Force fighter, designed by Sydney Camm's team at Hawker Aircraft, manufactured in British factories, delivered through official channels, flown by properly commissioned pilots in authorized combat operations across the European theatre. There was nothing banned about it, nothing forbidden, nothing illicit about the machine itself. So let's get something straight before we go any further. The question that's been circulating, how was the plane illegal, deserves a direct answer. And that answer is simple. The Typhoon wasn't illegal in any way, shape or form. What made the story on January 20th, 1943 extraordinary wasn't the aircraft sitting on the tarmac at RAF Manston. It was what one Belgian pilot decided to do with it, without permission, without authorization, without a single senior officer nodding approval. And that distinction between an illegal aircraft and an unauthorized mission is the real story worth telling. Because honestly, the unauthorized version is more interesting. A man with official sanction attacking an enemy building is war. A man defying his own chain of command to strike the Gestapo occupying his homeland? That's something else entirely. That's personal. That's vengeance wrapped in the thin clothing of military operations. Let me tell you about Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps. First, though, we need to establish what he was flying. Because the Typhoon itself has a story that matters, and it's not the story of some forbidden weapon. The Hawker Typhoon entered Ramforce service in 1941 with big expectations and even bigger problems. The Air Ministry wanted it to be a high-altitude interceptor, something that could match the new Focke-Wulf Fw 190 that was giving Spitfire pilots nightmares over the Channel. Sydney Camm's design promised devastating firepower and impressive speed. On paper, it looked like exactly what the RAF needed. In practice, disaster. The problems started with the engine. The Napier Sabre was an H-24 configuration monster with sleeve valves instead of poppet valves, an engineering decision that sounded clever until pilots started dying. The engine was temperamental at the best of times. At high altitude, where interceptors needed to perform, it became something worse. Engine failures killed pilots before they ever saw the enemy. And those were the lucky ones, in a grim sense. The unlucky ones experienced the tail problem. Structural weaknesses in the tail assembly led to catastrophic in-flight breakups. Imagine that for a moment. You're at 20,000 feet fighting for altitude when the entire tail section of your aircraft simply separates from the fuselage. No warning, no recovery possible, just a tumbling death that ends when you hit the ground. Pilots in training died this way. Pilots on operational missions died this way. The squadrons flying Typhoons reported losses from mechanical failure that exceeded their combat casualties. There were serious conversations at the Air Ministry about scrapping the entire program and concentrating resources on proven designs like the Spitfire. The Typhoon was, by most measures, a failure as what it was supposed to be. But here's the thing about failures. Sometimes they're just successes wearing the wrong clothes. Where the Typhoon struggled as a high-altitude interceptor, it excelled at something else entirely. Drop it down to low altitude, 50 feet, 100 feet, screaming across the French countryside below the effective engagement envelope of most anti-aircraft guns, and the aircraft transformed. That troublesome Napier Sabre engine delivered tremendous power at sea level, 2,200 horsepower, pushing the aircraft to speeds around 400 miles per hour in a dive. The airframe that flexed dangerously under high-altitude stresses proved rock solid when hugging the terrain. The poor rate of climb that crippled it as an interceptor became irrelevant when your entire mission profile was conducted at rooftop level. And then there was the armament. 4 20mm Hispano cannons. Not machine guns, cannons. High explosive and armor-piercing rounds that could shred a locomotive, tear apart a truck convoy, or punch through the thin top armor of a panzer tank. When rockets were added later in the war, the Typhoon became the most feared ground attack aircraft in the Western theatre. One viewer put it perfectly. The Typhoon was an excellent low-altitude ground attack fighter with good speed and heavy armament. Good at chewing up tanks. That's exactly right. The pilots who flew it knew that once they found its true role, they were sitting in one of the most devastating weapons platforms of the entire war. There was nothing illegal about any of this. The Typhoon was a legitimate piece of military equipment. Troubled, yes, but authorized and operational. The RAF used it for what they called rhubarbs, small-scale, opportunistic attacks that kept pressure on German occupation forces across the Channel. Train busting, supply convoys, airfield strafing. Targets of opportunity that tied down German resources in rear area defense and reminded the occupiers that they were never truly safe. This was the aircraft Jean de Selys Longchamps flew in January 1943. Not a banned weapon, not a forbidden technology, just a fighter plane with 4 cannons and a pilot who had other ideas about what constituted an acceptable target. Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps was 30 years old in January 1943. The title Baron wasn't theatrical affectation. He came from genuine Belgian nobility, from a family whose roots in the Belgian establishment stretched back generations. The Selys Longchamps name carried weight in pre-war Belgium. These were people who mattered in their society, not because they demanded deference, but because their family had been part of the fabric of Belgian life for so long that removing them would have been like pulling threads from a tapestry. When World War II began on September 1st, 1939, and let me be absolutely clear about that date because it matters, September 1st, 1939, when German forces crossed the Polish frontier, not 1940, as has sometimes been incorrectly stated. Belgium declared neutrality and hoped the war would pass it by. Hope is not a strategy. By May 1940, German forces had crushed Belgian neutrality under the Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg. The government fled to London. The army surrendered. The citizens found themselves living under occupation, watching German soldiers march down their streets, hearing German commands issued in their cities, seeing the swastika flying from buildings where Belgian flags had hung. For a man like Jean de Selys Longchamps, remaining in occupied Belgium meant one of two things: collaboration or powerlessness. Neither option was acceptable. He escaped across the Channel. The exact circumstances of his journey aren't as well documented as his later actions, but thousands of Belgians made similar crossings in those dark months. Fishing boats, smuggling routes, dangerous passages across waters patrolled by German aircraft and E-boats. They came to continue the fight. They came because staying meant watching their country disappear and doing nothing about it. The RAF offered Longchamps what he wanted most: a chance to fight for Belgium. They trained him as a fighter pilot. They gave him wings. Eventually, they posted him to 609 Squadron, one of the auxiliary squadrons that had fought through the Battle of Britain and now conducted offensive operations over occupied France and the Low Countries. He was a flight lieutenant by January 1943. A legitimate RAF officer, a properly commissioned pilot flying authorized combat missions in a standard military aircraft. And he was burning with something that official channels couldn't contain. The SIPO-SD had established its Brussels headquarters at 453 Avenue Louise. That designation, SIPO-SD, technically referred to the security police and security service, but everyone called them the Gestapo. It was simpler. And in practical terms, the distinctions between Nazi security organizations mattered less than what they actually did. Arrests, interrogations, deportations, and the systematic terrorization of the Belgian population. Avenue Louise was, and still is today, a prestigious thoroughfare in Brussels. Elegant townhouses, commercial buildings that speak to Belgian bourgeois prosperity. The kind of street where respectable people lived and worked before the war. The Nazis had requisitioned the building at number 453 precisely because its central location and imposing structure projected power. This was not some anonymous warehouse on the industrial outskirts. This was a statement. We are here, in the heart of your capital, and there is nothing you can do about it. From this address, they coordinated the machinery of occupation. Resistance fighters were brought here for interrogation. Intelligence networks were dismantled from desks in these rooms. Belgian civilians were processed for deportation to camps from which many never returned. The building at 453 Avenue Louise wasn't just administrative infrastructure. It was a torture house dressed in bureaucratic respectability. For Jean de Selys Longchamps, watching from exile in England, it was not an abstract headquarters on a planning map. This was his country, his city, his people being fed into that building and emerging broken, or not emerging at all. And he knew exactly where it was. He could picture it. He had probably walked past it in his pre-war life, back when it was just another building on a familiar street. Before the men inside it dedicated themselves to destroying everything he loved about Belgium. He wanted to attack it. Not metaphorically, not someday when the liberation came. He wanted to fly his Typhoon down Avenue Louise and put cannon shells through the windows where they interrogated Belgian resistance. He wanted the Gestapo officers inside that building to know, if only for a few terrifying seconds, what it felt like to be on the receiving end. So he asked permission. The answer was no. He asked again, denied. He asked through whatever channels a flight lieutenant could access. His requests to attack the Brussels Gestapo headquarters were flatly denied, again and again, by RAF leadership. The reasons made military sense, even as they felt morally impossible. Allied High Command was cautious about provoking heavier German reprisals against civilians. A raid on Gestapo headquarters would be spectacular. The propaganda value alone was obvious, but the Germans would respond with fury, and that fury would fall on Belgians who couldn't fly away afterward. This was the calculus of occupation warfare. Every sabotage action, every assassination, every resistance operation triggered reprisals. German policy was explicit. Kill one German soldier and 50 hostages might be executed. Blow up one railway line and a village might be burned. The British government and the Free Belgian forces in exile understood this equation with sickening clarity. They couldn't authorize strikes whose primary benefit was symbolic satisfaction if the price was paid in Belgian blood. Beyond the reprisal calculation, there was the question of military discipline. RAF leadership explicitly stated that pilots could not fly off and play resistance fighter. This wasn't bureaucratic fussiness. It was the foundation of coordinated military operations. Think about it from their perspective. An air force cannot function if every pilot with a personal grudge decides to pursue vendettas instead of assigned missions. You need to know where your aircraft are. You need to coordinate coverage over convoys, timing over targets, fuel calculations that assume pilots are going where they're sent. Allow one pilot to freelance and you invite chaos. Soon, every Belgian pilot wants to hit something in Belgium. Every Polish pilot wants to hit something in Poland. Every French pilot wants to settle a score in France. The system says no, has to say no. Jean de Selys Longchamps heard these denials. He understood the reasoning intellectually. He kept flying his authorized missions. He kept returning to base. He kept watching the war grind on while the building at 453 Avenue Louise remained undamaged, its windows intact, its occupants going about their business of destruction. The tension between duty and desire built month after month. January 20th, 1943. The morning broke cold over the English Channel. Ground crews stamped their feet on the hard stands at RAF Manston. Pilots checked their cockpit heaters twice before strapping in. Jean de Selys Longchamps rose with his squadron mates, attended the briefing, and received his assigned mission for the day. What that mission was doesn't really matter now. History has forgotten it. What matters is that he took off with orders to accomplish something else entirely. This wasn't a rogue takeoff in a stolen aircraft. This was a properly authorized combat sortie that became something unauthorized only after his wheels left the ground. The Typhoon climbed away from Manston, that battered Kent airfield, with its scarred runways and dispersal areas showing years of Luftwaffe attention. Once airborne, Longchamps was in a space that every military pilot knows: the temporary autonomy of flight. You're connected to command only by radio. Your decisions are your own until you land and face the consequences. He didn't immediately turn toward Brussels. He flew whatever initial course was expected, established himself in the mission pattern, did everything right. And then, at some point, he made a decision that would define his legacy. He diverted, turned southeast, set course for Belgium, for the building at 453 Avenue Louise. The cockpit of a Typhoon was cramped and businesslike. Instruments clustered around the pilot in an arrangement that made sense once you were trained. The reflector gun sight sat directly in front of his eyes, ready to project its orange aiming circle onto whatever target he chose. The Napier sabre roared behind the firewall, pushing him across the grey Channel waters toward home. Crossing the Belgian coast, he dropped to low altitude. This was the Typhoon's element, where its speed advantage over enemy fighters was greatest, where anti-aircraft gunners had the least time to react, where the aircraft's strengths overwhelmed its weaknesses. He screamed across the winter landscape, hedge-hopping, following contours, using trees and buildings to mask his approach. He knew Brussels. He knew the approaches. He knew exactly where Avenue Louise sat in relation to the landmarks flashing beneath his wings. This wasn't a blind strike against coordinates on a map. This was a man coming home. The route from the coast to Brussels covered perhaps 50 miles. At the Typhoon's low-level speed, that meant roughly 10 minutes of flight time. 10 minutes during which Jean de Selys Longchamps was committed to something that would either make him a hero or a court-martial defendant, or possibly both. Avenue Louise appeared ahead, unmistakable even from the low-level perspective of a fighter cockpit. Elegant buildings sliding past on either side as he lined up his approach. The reflector sight settling on the facade of number 453. Inside that building, men were working at desks, perhaps conducting interrogations, perhaps filing paperwork, perhaps doing the mundane administrative tasks that made the Nazi terror apparatus function. They had no warning. The Typhoon was too fast, too low, too committed for anyone to do anything except die or dive for cover. Jean de Selys Longchamps pressed the firing button. 4 Hispano cannons roared to life simultaneously. The Typhoon shuddered under the recoil as high-explosive and armor-piercing shells tore into the Gestapo headquarters at point-blank range. Windows shattered inward. Walls crumbled where shells punched through. The thunder of cannon fire rolled down Avenue Louise, shocking pedestrians into frozen disbelief before instinct took over and they scattered. Inside the building, chaos. The screams of the wounded, the crash of collapsing furniture, the desperate shouts of men trying to understand what was happening to their supposedly safe headquarters in the heart of occupied Brussels. The accounts aren't entirely clear on whether he made one pass or multiple runs. What is certain is that when he finally pulled up and turned west, back toward England, the building at 453 Avenue Louise was smoking. Its facade was scarred by cannon fire, and the Gestapo presence in Brussels had just received a message that no amount of reprisal could erase. They were not safe. Not even in their headquarters, not even in the heart of the city they occupied. A Belgian had come home, however briefly, and he had come armed with 4 20mm cannons and the rage of exile. The return flight to England was presumably quieter, adrenaline draining, the magnitude of what he had done beginning to settle in. The Napier sabre droning on, carrying him back across the Channel, back toward friendly territory, back toward a reckoning. When the Typhoon rolled to a stop at RAF Manston, cannon barrels still warm, Jean de Selys Longchamps climbed from the cockpit, knowing consequences would come quickly. He hadn't attempted to hide anything. The aircraft's gun cameras would have recorded the attack. His deviation from the assigned mission was documented in flight records. Ground crews could see the carbon scoring on the cannon ports. Everything about the situation announced that something unauthorized had happened. The initial reaction from his immediate superiors probably combined shock, admiration, and fury in equal measure. Fighter pilots understood, better than anyone, the desire to strike back against enemy infrastructure. Many of them had watched friends die, had seen casualty lists grow, had learned of resistance fighters captured and executed. Sympathy for what Longchamps had done was almost certainly widespread among the men who flew alongside him. But sympathy doesn't translate to official approval, and it couldn't. The chain of command faced an impossible dilemma. A pilot had just executed a spectacularly successful attack on a legitimate enemy target, demonstrating exactly the kind of courage, aggression, and precision that the RAF prized in its fighter pilots. And he had done so in direct defiance of explicit orders. If there were no consequences, the message to every other pilot with a personal grudge would be clear. Do what you want, and if it works out, nothing will happen. That was a recipe for complete breakdown of military discipline. The RAF transcript noted that such insubordination could not be ignored, even if the results were spectacular. There it is. The entire dilemma in one sentence. The results were spectacular. The Gestapo headquarters in Brussels had been attacked in broad daylight by a lone fighter, catching the Germans completely off guard, demonstrating that their occupation headquarters were vulnerable. The morale impact in occupied Belgium was enormous. Word spread through resistance networks, through whispered conversations, that someone had struck back. But spectacular results didn't make insubordination acceptable. The system had to respond. As punishment for the unauthorized raid, Longchamps was immediately demoted from flight lieutenant to flying officer. This wasn't a trivial slap on the wrist. It represented a significant reduction in rank, in pay, in authority, in status. A flight lieutenant was a relatively senior officer in a fighter squadron. A flying officer was more junior, still respectable, but clearly lower in the hierarchy. The demotion announced to everyone that what he had done was officially wrong, whatever their personal feelings. Beyond the demotion, he was transferred out of 609 Squadron entirely. They posted him to number 3 Squadron, removing him from the unit where he had served, where he knew the other pilots, where he had built relationships and reputation. This transfer broke up any potential conspiracy of like-minded pilots who might be inspired by his example. It sent him somewhere he would be watched more carefully. It made clear that while he would continue to serve, he would do so under closer supervision. And yet, the story doesn't end with punishment. Because the same command structure that had to discipline him also recognized something undeniable. He had demonstrated exactly the qualities that made great fighter pilots. Courage under conditions that would have made lesser men turn back. Precise flying at extreme low altitude. Effective weapons delivery against a defended target. The news of the raid spread beyond the immediate military hierarchy. The Belgian government in exile heard about it. The British public heard about it. The story of a lone Belgian pilot attacking the Gestapo headquarters in his occupied capital was exactly the kind of narrative that sustained wartime morale. There are suggestions in various sources that Longchamps received some form of recognition for his actions even as he was being disciplined for them, though the exact nature of this recognition varies depending on the account. The demotion stood. But there may have been quieter acknowledgements, the kind of complicated messaging that military institutions excel at when official policy conflicts with unofficial admiration. The RAF could not openly encourage what he had done, but they could, perhaps through channels less formal than official decorations, signal that courage of this magnitude had been noticed. It was a very British solution. Reprimand the man for breaking the rules. Find ways, however ambiguous, to acknowledge how he broke them. The building at 453 Avenue Louise still stands today. You can find it on Google Maps. You can walk down that same street and look up at the same facade where cannon shells punched through in January 1943. The damage has been repaired, of course. Nearly 80 years have passed, and buildings heal even when the scars of history remain invisible. But here's the remarkable thing. You can actually see it. You can actually go there. This isn't an abstract historical footnote buried in archives that only academics access. It's a physical location that anyone can visit. The building next door still stands as well. The street retains its character as one of Brussels' elegant boulevards, lined with the kind of architecture that speaks to pre-war prosperity. Something happened here, something real. A man in a Typhoon screamed down this street at hundreds of miles per hour and made the occupiers feel, for a few seconds, what occupation felt like from the other side. For viewers who care about the tangible connections between past and present, this matters. History isn't just dates and names. It's places you can stand in, buildings you can touch, streets where you can feel the echo of events that shaped the world. Avenue Louise is one of those places. January 20th, 1943 is written invisibly on its stones. The question naturally arises, were there other raids like this? The answer is yes, though not exactly like this, and not with this particular combination of unauthorized personal vengeance and official military disapproval. The RAF conducted several precision strikes on Gestapo facilities during the war. The de Havilland Mosquito, that remarkable wooden aircraft that could fly fast enough to evade most interceptors, was the weapon of choice for these operations. Operation Jericho in February 1944 targeted Amiens prison, where resistance fighters were being held for execution. Mosquitoes breached the prison walls at low level, allowing some prisoners to escape. In March 1945, another Mosquito raid hit the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. These were authorized operations, planned at the highest levels, coordinated with intelligence agencies and resistance networks. They represented official policy, not individual rebellion. That's what makes Longchamps different. He didn't wait for approval that might never come. He didn't coordinate with anyone. He simply decided, alone in a cockpit over the English Channel, that some things are worth the consequences. The Mosquito raids deserve their own telling, and perhaps that's a story for another video. They were remarkable operations in their own right, demonstrating precision and courage that few air forces could have matched. But they were sanctioned courage. Longchamps offered something rawer, something that didn't fit neatly into the command structure. What happened to Jean de Selys Longchamps afterward? He continued to serve. The demotion didn't end his career. The transfer didn't ground him. He flew with No. 3 Squadron, presumably under closer supervision, but still operational, still contributing to the war effort. The details of his subsequent service are less dramatic than the raid that made him famous. That's the nature of wartime aviation. Most missions don't make history. They're grinding, dangerous work that kills pilots without producing headlines. Day after day of sorties, some combat, some nothing. The gradual accumulation of flying hours and the gradual depletion of luck that every pilot feels somewhere beneath their confidence. What we know for certain is that Jean de Selys Longchamps continued flying after his demotion and transfer to No. 3 Squadron. The historical record on his subsequent fate is less clear than the vivid documentation of his unauthorized raid, but perhaps that ambiguity is fitting. He had made his statement. He had struck his blow. Whatever happened afterward, the building at 453 Avenue Louise would bear the marks of his passage until time or renovation erased them. Fighter pilots in 1943 faced mortality rates that would be unacceptable in any modern context. To climb into a cockpit day after day, knowing the statistics, required a relationship with death that most people never develop. Longchamps knew this when he turned toward Brussels. He knew it every time he strapped in afterward. The man who attacked the Gestapo headquarters had already decided that some things mattered more than survival. So let's return to where we started. The Hawker Typhoon was not an illegal aircraft. It was a standard RAF fighter, troubled, yes, with engine problems and structural failures that nearly killed the program before it found its true purpose. But it was a legitimate military weapon, manufactured in British factories, flown by commissioned pilots, used in authorized operations throughout the war. The lazy framing of illegal aircraft misses what actually makes this story compelling. It turns a complex tale of duty, rebellion, and personal vengeance into a simple narrative about forbidden technology. That's not what happened. That's not why anyone should care. What happened was this. A Belgian nobleman watched his country fall to Nazi occupation. He escaped to continue the fight. He joined the RAF and became a fighter pilot. He flew authorized missions while burning inside with the desire to strike a specific target, the building where the Gestapo tortured his countrymen. He asked permission to attack that building. He was denied, repeatedly. And then one morning, on a mission assigned for other purposes, he made a choice. He turned his aircraft toward Brussels. He dropped to low altitude. He lined up on Avenue Louise. 4 20mm cannons. High explosive and armor-piercing shells. The crash of shattered windows and crumbling walls. The chaos of Gestapo officers diving for cover as death came screaming down their street. Courage, ingenuity, and vengeance. That's what a viewer called it, and that's exactly right. The unauthorized mission. The standard aircraft. The consequences, both punitive and perhaps, in quieter ways, honourable. The building that still stands. The man who decided some missions are worth the consequences. This wasn't an illegal aircraft story. It was a story about a man who decided some missions are worth the consequences. That's more interesting than clickbait ever was. The building at 453 Avenue Louise has been repurposed over the decades. The scars are gone. Brussels moves around it, modern traffic flowing where pedestrians once ran for cover from cannon fire. But if you stand there, and you can, anyone can, you're standing where history happened, where a single pilot in a single aircraft decided that orders weren't more important than justice,
where the occupiers learned they weren't safe anywhere, not even in the heart of the capital they controlled. The Typhoon that made that attack was scrapped long ago. Aircraft didn't survive the war as monuments. They were flown until they crashed or wore out or became obsolete, then stripped for parts and melted down. No museum displays the specific machine Jean de Selys Longchamps flew that January morning. But Typhoons survive. You can see them in aviation museums. You can stand next to those 4 20mm cannons and understand, viscerally, what they could do to a building or a truck convoy or a formation of German tanks. The aircraft looks brutal even standing still. In motion, at low altitude, guns blazing. It must have been the last thing many German soldiers ever saw. Good at chewing up tanks, as the viewer said. Good at other things too. I want to be clear about something before we finish. Some viewers pointed out that previous coverage of this story used the wrong date for the start of World War II. That matters. Not because we should turn this into a pedantic correction video. The heart of the story is still the rogue pilot, not the calendar. But because getting basic facts wrong undermines everything else. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. That's the timeline. Belgium fell in May 1940. By January 1943, when Longchamps made his raid, Belgium had been under occupation for nearly 3 years. These dates matter because they establish the weight of what he was feeling. 3 years of occupation. 3 years of watching from exile while the Gestapo set up shop at 453 Avenue Louise. 3 years of authorized missions that never struck the target he most wanted to hit. 3 years of building pressure that found release in 30 seconds of cannon fire. Accuracy honors the story. It doesn't diminish drama, it grounds it in reality. Jean de Selys Longchamps was a real person who made real choices in a real war. The least we can do is get the facts right. What would you have done? That's the question that lingers after the facts are laid out. You're a Belgian aristocrat in exile. Your country is occupied. Your countrymen are being tortured in a building you know intimately, on a street you probably walked as a civilian. You have the skills, the aircraft, and the opportunity to strike that building. Your superiors say no, repeatedly, for reasons that make military sense even as they feel morally impossible. Do you follow orders? Do you accept the logic of the larger war effort, the calculus of reprisals, the discipline that holds the military together? Or do you make a different calculation? Jean de Selys Longchamps made his choice on January 20th, 1943. He accepted the consequences that followed. He paid the price in official punishment and transfer to another squadron. The building still stands. The Typhoon was never illegal. Only the mission was unauthorized. And that, somehow, makes it more heroic than any sanctioned operation could have been. He wasn't following orders. He wasn't doing what he was told. He was doing what he believed was right, knowing it would cost him, accepting that cost, and flying anyway. That's not obedience. That's something else entirely. Subscribe for more stories like this.